Yeah, we can do faces first, and then we'll go to the screen sharing.
Okay.
All right. Hi, everybody. Hello again. Welcome to our second panel of this week for the 2020 Oregon Science Startup Forum. This is our second of 5 panels. They're all at noon Pacific this week. Today is Should I Form a Business? Tomorrow is How Do I Form a Company? Thursday, How to Fund Your Startup. And then Friday is our pitch coaching session, Practice Your Pitch. The direct link will be emailed to you at 1:55 each day. We are using the chat function on Zoom if you would like to ask your questions to the panel. I'd like to thank our sponsors, again, Onami, Absci, Otrati, Illumina, the Berglund Center at Pacific University, and Virtue Lab. I have the distinct honor of introducing our panel moderator and long-running sponsor, Andy Soria, who is the director of the Berglund Center at Pacific University. It is an innovation center and small business incubator established in 2014. Andy has been involved with the development of new products and alternative energy technologies for over 20 years. He also teaches courses in the broad context of energy, sustainability, and environmental science. Prior to academia, he was involved in large-scale geothermal energy research across Latin America, and he has a PhD in natural resources wood chemistry from the University of Idaho. Andy, thank you for your support, and we look forward to this panel.
Thank you, Jim. So I will attempt to share this screen, and forgive me for a second. I've been doing Zoom forever, but still, sometimes technology doesn't work terribly well. So welcome to this panel. This panel is designed to discuss those early questions that we may have as scientists, if our science, if our actual work can lend itself to develop a business around it. And I am going to ask each one of the panelists that we have to introduce themselves to the world, because I will do an awful job at that. It is certainly not one of my strengths, doing personal introductions, but I will begin with Dr. Jenn Amador. Jenn, would you please wave and introduce yourself?
Hello. Yeah, so I'm Jenn Amador. I'm the COO of nexTC, which is an early stage material science startup. I'm also a trainer for the Ecospecies Lens of the Market program, which teaches how to translate basic research like what most of, I guess, the audience does or has experience in into starting a business. We look at a couple of different markets. All of our solutions right now are thin film materials on glass. So that's fun, as you might well imagine, because working on glass is hard. And I've been doing this for about 3 years now. We just recently received another SBIR phase 1, this time from the National Science Foundation for an offshoot project. So we're doing well, and I'm excited to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Jenn. Next, I would like Katrine Bosley to please introduce herself to the audience.
Hey everybody, I'm Katrine. I come from the world of biotechnology. I've been in biotech for about 30 years now in a variety of different capacities. So while I'm not a scientist myself, I've hung out with scientists quite a lot and have worked in small molecules, in gene editing, in biologics, and in a range of different disease areas over the years, primarily in business roles, either business development or more recently I've been CEO of a couple different companies, and working to translate the early science from cool but often very young and or academic science into actual products. And in my case, that means medicines, so therapeutics and medicines. Currently, I'm chairman of the board of a company called Arrakis Therapeutics, which is working on small molecules to drug RNA, with RNA as the target. So lots of fun science there, talking about structures of RNAs and things like that. I'm also on the board of a couple of other biotech companies, as well as the Mass Eye and Ear Institute, which is obviously a nonprofit academic teaching hospital. So getting exposed to the side of healthcare that's actually treating the patients in addition to trying to create the medicines.
Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Anna Brown.
Hi, I'm Anna Brown. I'm the founder and CEO of Stark Street Materials, which is built to develop radiation shielding materials. So right now we're really focused on radiation shielding garments for medical personnel. And this was a technology I developed as a grad student at Portland State University, and through a long set of trial and error found a market for. So that's a sort of a specific story that maybe we'll get into.
Well, for sure we will.
Yeah.
So let's jump in. So again, this panel is going to investigate a little bit of the process of going from an idea to a business and really what it takes to make that transition. And sometimes, you know, we in the labs, we try to do our work the best we can. And sometimes we stumble into something that is not found elsewhere, or that it's doing something in a unique way. And that single discovery may be one of the core sort of motivators for us to consider launching a business. Maybe at a conference or some networking event, we get to meet people that may be intrigued by what we're working on, and they demonstrate an interest in actually taking this a step further, or the market itself has the need for what you have in hand, and that becomes your motivator to launch a business. Sometimes, as Jen sort of mentions, there's SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research Grants, or other types of funding mechanisms that allow us to further explore the ideas and develop potential business opportunities around what our work entails. Other times we just have the entrepreneurial bug. There may be other opportunities, other things that that motivate us to consider this idea of going from being a lab rat to being a lab rat, but also a CEO of a company. Maybe you have know-how, and I don't necessarily mean patents or other things, but maybe a trade secret or something that enables you to do something better than others. And that also becomes your motivator. And there's, the list is personal, and so it can't be endless as far as what actually drives us to consider our science, our idea, as an opportunity to actually create a business endeavor around. So to the panelists, I'm going to ask a series of questions. First one, starting off with, how did each of you actually evolve your decision to launch a business? Followed, if you can, I'm going to be calling on each one of you to answer all the questions at once, and so I'll leave them on the screen. What were the conditions that led you to that decision? Who was involved in that decision? Of course, nothing happens in vacuum, so our family, friends, mentors, partners, and some idea of what your actual company looked like initially. So I'm going to start off with Jen. And Jen, if you could share with us some of these experiences that you had.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to. So I'll just go ahead and give a little narrative because I think it hits all of these pretty neatly. So in 2017, I was just wrapping up my PhD in chemistry, and my PI came to me and said that he had talked to some guys in the solar industry who were very interested in a technology that was coming out of his lab. He had met them at a material science conference. They had networked and hit it off. They'd ended up talking about the future of the field. And they said, wouldn't it be really cool if someone could do this? And my PI thought about that and was like, it would be great. And I think we can do that. So he actually had me start on that project. And when it showed a little bit of promise, at that point, he told me very honestly that he thought that we could start a company if that was something that I would like to do. It was something I had thought about. I tried a couple other ventures at that point that had not panned out. Fail fast, right? And I knew that I wanted to work at a startup. So with 6 months to go until graduation, I said, great, let's do it. And we started doing customer discovery. In terms of who was involved in that decision, definitely my mentor in terms of my PI, also my professional mentor. I talked with her quite a bit about, should I do this or not? What are really the risks to me? But at that point, I knew that there was a little bit of funding in place for me to at least become a postdoc. So I had that safety net. Not perfect. Nobody wants to be a postdoc forever, but it was something that I could do and still pay my bills. And so I went, all right, let's do this. My family, my parents are very, my mom's big question was, will you have health insurance if you go for this? And I said, yes, Mom, it'll be fine. And my dad kind of sighed and was like, you know, when I was your age, I tried to start a business and it went really well until it didn't. So good luck. So they weren't terribly involved. They did ask for a little bit of their feedback, but mostly it was me saying, all right, I think that this could work. I've done my own research. I've talked to people in the field that I trust. Let's go for it. That initial company was myself, another postdoc at OSU, and our PI acting as kind of a technical advisor. That has evolved over time. We have an actual advisory board now, and we hired our first employee in February. So from 2017 to 2020, we have evolved a little bit. Our preliminary market, we refined quite a bit. It's still in solar. It's not quite what we thought it was, and that's just fine. But in terms of, I think, the big changes that a lot of startups go through, we got very lucky. We started very early on with customer discovery, finding out what it is that the market actually wanted and cared about, so that we weren't trying to put a square peg into a round hole, so to speak. And we were able to tailor our research and really focus in on what we were doing to meet that unmet need.
Thank you, Jen. And yes, we will be actually talking a little bit about that market identification in the next set of questions, but that's a great story, and I really appreciate you sharing that with us. Anna, if you could jump in and share with us your answers to these questions framed from your perspective.
Well, in contrast to Jen's story, which sounded like it started out the right way, which is there's a market need for something and we have the expertise to make something. I sort of started the opposite way. I made something that I thought was really cool and I needed to figure out who was going to buy it. So when I was a graduate student, a little bit before 2017, so I think this was back in 2011, developed a radio opaque ink that I thought everybody's going to want radio opaque ink. You know, you can make up X-ray contrast materials. You know, doctors could mark on a patient's leg saying, you know, operate on this one, don't operate on this one. It could, you know, all sorts of ideas. So we pitched it to Portland State to patent, and they said, yes, this is an interesting patent. Part of this process is going to be that you're going to pitch it to a master's class of business students. So these are students getting their MBA, and they're going to do a market analysis on it. So they went through a term. They found out the ink idea was not interesting to anybody, but making markers for surgical sponges. So if you could make surgical sponges more X-ray opaque, that would be a neat market. And so two of those students were so into this idea, they started a company. And they brought me along because, you know, I was graduating and needed a job and it was going to be exciting. We were going to do a startup. And as soon as we started digging down into the market, there probably was a market need for it, but it's really hard to sell surgical sponges because they're a really inexpensive commodity product. And as you know, anybody in biotech will know or makes devices, selling to hospitals, you have to have a really, really good reason. So that didn't pan out, and that company sort of closed down. And I went and did a postdoc, which had been my plan for a long time. And then when I was done with my postdoc, I kind of came back to this technology and started fleshing out another idea, which was the X-ray opaque aprons. So it was a little bit of a circuitous route. And as soon as I started really digging into why would somebody want a lighter weight, non-toxic X-ray opaque apron, A whole bunch of other needs fell out. We're going to talk about the customer discovery process, I guess, but I think that's probably the most important thing for if you're a scientist and you're trying to translate and look at an idea. You really can't figure it out by sitting at a desk yourself. You have to go talk to people, and you have to learn the market, and you have to figure out why somebody is prepared to pay money for a thing you might make or a technology you might have. And that's just not something that's in the literature. And that's a really frustrating process. So that's that's my big lesson is I made a thing and somebody wants it, or I think somebody wants it, but until you talk to them, you have no idea.
Right. So when you moved into this apron idea, what did your initial company look like? And the reason why this question I'm posing it is because we have preconceived notions that perhaps to launch something you need to have, all your ducks align, which in an ideal world you do, but in reality it isn't. So what did that initial company, when you jump back into the entrepreneurship world, look like? Right?
It was just me initially, and part of it was support from Portland State, and then Portland State also sponsored myself, my graduate advisor, and an industry mentor to go through the National Science Foundation I-Corps program. So I'm happy to answer questions about that if anybody has any is interested in that particular process. But that really was one of the most valuable entrepreneurial lessons I've ever had. So did that. I have a lab down at the Portland State Business Accelerator. I had an employee for a while, and then she went to grad school as planned. And right now, getting some grants, proposals together, figuring out some funding, and trying to figure out, because it turns out actually making prototype materials, you need kind of a lot of equipment. So figuring out how to do that, how to get the lab wired with 380 voltage wiring, just little details. But right now it's just me in the accelerator.
All right. And so I left Katrine to the end because you're coming with so much experience in so many different business at different scales, from startups all the way to Wall Street, that perhaps your insights and wisdom come with a different perspective than both Jenn and Anna, who are actually knee deep in the starting portion. So Katrine, if you don't mind addressing these questions.
Sure. Well, I have to say, given Anna and Jenn's comments, I definitely know I do not have more wisdom than they do. I may have a few more years under my belts, but they actually touched on a couple of the most fundamental questions to think about. First and foremost, and this gets framed a lot of different ways, but who's going to care? Like literally, who's going to care about the thing that you're in love with? And Anna talked about figuring out the market, and Jenn talked about that too. But that's probably the most fundamental question, because I think for all of us who love science, love technology, and who live tinkering and seeing new stuff, and those amazing moments when you see a new piece of data for the very first time, and you're like, oh, nobody else in the world knows this. That doesn't mean somebody else is going to care, or that it's going to solve somebody's problem. And it was interesting because a couple companies ago for me, I was at a company called Avila Therapeutics. And this was a chemistry, it's a biotech, so working to make new medicines. Chemistry company where we were doing covalent, irreversible small molecules. So the small molecule is going to covalently and irreversibly bind to its target. So I wasn't the founder or the inventor. The founder was a chemist, Jaswinder Singh, who computational chemist by training, and he had this idea for a long time. He got laid off by the company he was working for and decided instead of taking another job, he was going to, with his family and young kids and everything else, he was going to try to start this company he'd always thought of. And he actually got it started, and I joined it when I was a couple of years old, and I joined as CEO in that case, and he was the chief scientific officer. But the interesting thing was, I heard about this from them. I believed their pitch. I thought it was pretty cool. And then I started to do my due diligence, and I realized that the entire pharmaceutical industry already knows about this idea, and they think it is horrible, terrible, wrong, bad, shouldn't do it, just stay away. And I was like, oh, but Just is a pretty smart guy. Like, what's the disconnect? And so the interesting thing was diving into that and figuring out there's a reason the whole farm, they're not stupid. There's a reason they think this is a terrible idea. And it had, for those of you who are in that kind of science, it has to do with haptenization and the risk of creating an immune response to yourself because of the haptenization of the small molecule. That's the risk. And it's not theoretical, right? There are instances where that has been observed. So we know it's possible. So there's very good reasons that the pharma industry thinks this is a bad idea, literally has written rules for their chemists. Can't do this. And yet Just, smart guy, he's been thinking about this for a long time. He basically saw it as, well, if you do it right, that's not an issue. You have to avoid that. Because, oh, by the way, aspirin. If I could see you all in person, I would ask you to raise your hand if you've ever taken an aspirin, because aspirin is, thank you. Yes, I see some virtual hands. That's awesome. Aspirin is a covalent, irreversible small molecule. So you have this disconnect between, and by the way, there's lots of other drugs, all the proton pump inhibitors, there's tons of others that are covalent, irreversible inhibitors. Now, we know by the medical record that these are safe, effective medicines at the right dose, et cetera, et cetera. But what was this disconnect between everybody knows it's a bad idea and real medicines? And so pulling that apart and figuring out, that's an interesting scientific observation. That's not a company. And the way that we always kind of tried to have the conversation internally at Avila was we kept saying, what problem are we solving? Well, we can make a very specific inhibitor. We can, inhibit this isoform of the protein and avoid that isoform. Okay, you need to ask the question again, who's going to care? Does that solve a problem? And as we would keep peeling this apart and diving in, we were eventually really able to distill a couple of key problems we could solve, right? By being able to achieve unique specificity. In certain instances, that led to unique biology with a unique therapeutic hypothesis. So we had to connect it up to the biology of that target. But one was unique specificity. And that's often a problem if you're trying to make medicines. If you hit too many targets, you have safety issues and you don't have a medicine at that point. So unique specificity was one. And then the second kind of instance where we could really solve a problem was we could have a durable inhibition of that target over time, because once you bond to it, you don't let go. There's no dynamic equilibrium. You're irreversibly bonded. And that led to a different relationship between the pharmacokinetics and the pharmacodynamics, or the therapeutic effect. And sometimes that had biological importance. But we had to really be able to say why it was going to matter to the ultimate customer, which in our case, we don't usually use the word customer, because the customer, if you will, is a patient. It's a person with a disease. That's the ultimate customer. And so you have to do something for that person that's going to matter. And it's not, they don't care if it's covalent. The doctor actually doesn't care if it's covalent. Nobody cares it's covalent except maybe us. What they care about is you did something that no other options could do. So we also had to say, well, why is this going to be better than all of the other solutions that might be available to that patient? Better than a reversible small molecule or surgery or what have you. And so that kind of layered multiple asking of this question, what problem am I solving? I think it's at the root of all of these kinds of technology companies, because, when we first see science or technology that does something nothing's ever done before, that's just inherently exciting. I mean, we all like being in the world of science because it's inherently exciting. But if you want to start a company, connecting that to what problem it solves is fundamental. I just want to mention one other thing, and I'm happy to go into any, if there's specific questions that folks have about anything I've done as well. But Jenn had mentioned a little bit about people, and it matters a lot. I'll say who you're hanging out with, because being an entrepreneur is extremely difficult. It's really exciting. It's really fulfilling, but there will definitely be what I call these soul crushing moments. And you need people around you who can be sounding boards, can basically tell you you're not crazy. I didn't realize it until I kind of looked back later in my career, but I was kind of surrounded by a lot of entrepreneurs growing up. My grandfather had his own business. He was a nurseryman, so was my father. But even things like my mother worked at the public television station in Cleveland, and which is where I grew up. And WVIZ was run by Betty Cope. Betty Cope had founded WVIZ when television was a new technology, and making a television station, that was essentially being a business. And she was one of my role models growing up, and she was awesome. And that was just within my range of normal. Like, nobody I knew worked for a large company. Nobody in my family was a lawyer or an accountant or anything like that. So I was surrounded by people who built companies, different kinds, but built companies and organizations. And I think that if you aren't personally kind of surrounded by that growing up, put yourself in situations where you can be surrounded by that, by people who don't think it's crazy to want to build something from scratch. Partly because they'll just understand, psychologically where you're coming from, but also because they will have, in different industries, have faced different versions of a problem that you might be facing. And there's a real pattern recognition, whether it's, hey, if you defined your market well enough, or, it sounds like you need team building help, or let's look at your financials because your cash flow is not going to last. Whatever it is, some problems can be applied across very diverse industries. So talking to the people who are building stuff, those are the people that you want to ask for help from.
Thank you. So I'm going to move on because there is a method to the madness, and all of you have touched upon things that I wanted to explore a little further. And we are likely going to be pressed on time. So let me move on to the next issue, which we've already began discussing, which includes questions of skill and specifically questions of identifying the market. And for starting up scientists, we tend to do things, in the lab, either in graduate school or, for our work. That tends to be at a very, very small scale or small batch in order to prove some, fundamental scientific principle. And that raises the question, if we want to launch a business, if we are targeting a market that values what you're doing, even if it is at a small scale, or if you have to basically ramp it up to meet what the market is actually asking for, which is, larger volume production if you are in a products-driven sort of field. So the questions to the panelists are around the idea of both the market and the scale, which are, how did you learn about what the market expected of your product initially, and how did you manage to meet or manage the expectation of scale at the early phase of your company? So we'll reverse the order. I'll actually start with Katrine, and we'll go Anna and Jenn.
So I'm looking at the question of few specialized items versus volume production, and the answer is yes. Look, there's no single right model. This is a question you have to figure out for yourself. But it's partly there's a number of factors that are going to feed into it. Partly, what do you want? Maybe you want a little boutique business where you're very involved in everything. Maybe you want something that's going to scale. Neither one of those is a wrong answer. Obviously, the market is an important aspect of this, but also probably you're going to need different amounts of capital to build one versus the other. Can you pay the bills through the revenue you get, or is it going to be you need millions of dollars to be invested before you have any revenue? Biotech tends to be that second category because hundreds of millions to billions of dollars to get a drug approved. Now you can do partnerships along the way to bring in capital, but the capital requirements or the capital demands of one versus the other are going to shape your business strategy profoundly. If you take investors, they're going to own a piece of the company. You're not going to own all the decisions like you would if you kept it all for yourself. Now, again, neither one of those is right nor wrong, but you do have to match your market, your capital strategy, and what you personally want. I've mostly worked in businesses where, you know, biotech, it's venture backed, and then you're looking for additional capital along the way because, you know, you need a couple of $1 billion before you have an approved product. And that's just the nature of that particular field. But there's a lot of different ways to build a business successfully. You know, not all businesses need or should have venture. It's very expensive capital, has a lot of requirements. It's wonderful if you need that scale of capital, but it is a type of building a company. It's not the only way of building a company.
Thank you. Anna.
So my thoughts on this particular topic, to speak to scale, you know, as a nanoscientist, I feel like there's a good joke there, but I'm not going to make it. Anyway, nanomaterials have a huge amount of promise, and this is my field, and everybody's excited about them. Everybody's trying to figure out what to do with them, how they can solve all sorts of fascinating market needs. But one of the real challenges with synthetic nanomaterials is that they don't scale in reaction vessels. So you can make 10 milliliters of it, that's great. You might even be able to make 100 milliliters of that, but when you need to start making tens of thousands of liters of it, the reactions don't work the same. The assembly doesn't work the same. And that can be a really big problem if you need a lot of material to just test a generalized effect or even have viability for producing a, you know, or a company, and basically an industrial scale synthetic regime. And this is, I think, something that engineers, chemical engineers, are really going to work on a lot in the next couple of years, is figuring out how to scale nanomaterial synthesis. So you know, that's the really practical bench side of things. As far as like the market goes, when I first started, I really struggled with running quantitative analyses on market sizes and needs and business opportunities, because there were very few decimal places and the margins of error were in the hundreds of percents. So I like to call these brown numbers for a couple of different reasons, one of which is I'm Anna Brown. But just running those numbers and getting a sense of how big the market is, what the consumer size might be, how much someone would be willing to pay, what those numbers look like, and then how much material you might need. They aren't real numbers, right? This is not set in stone, but they give you an idea of scale. And that can be really helpful for planning a business, because if you can only make 10 milliliters of nanomaterial at a time and it takes one technician 2 hours, but a consumer needs what you would produce in 10 liters and they're only prepared to pay a certain amount of time, that's never going to be a business. So, you know, one of the first things I did for Stark Street was I bought a really big planetary ball mill to make my material. And I was really, really excited to spend, you know, $10,000 on a piece of equipment that I could make more than a couple of grams at a time. When I was during the first phase of the company, I actually, we had a small ball mill. It was about this big, and I screwed the cap on and off so many times I wore a hole in my hand, just to get enough material to make one small prototype. And now I could make, you know, kilograms of it in half an hour. And that was really thrilling. So that was a big step for the scale up of the prototyping material. And it's, you know, automation is great. Going from benchtop to automation is not, it's challenging and it's expensive. So, you know, it's you got to build it up in steps, and you got to be strategic about it and think high and plan low.
Thank you. Jen.
Yeah, so I think Anna and Katrine covered it pretty well, but when you're asking yourself, what scale do I need to be at? What you're really asking is, what scale does the market need me to be at before they care about what I'm doing? And the answer to that's going to vary by the end use market. So depending on what you want to do, as Katrine wisely pointed out, if you just want a lifestyle business, scale might not be something you really have to worry about. But if you're looking at the market and you go, okay, where are the real opportunities here? And everyone's demanding that you be at scale before they'll even talk to you, or they're telling you, okay, we'll buy from you, you know, when you hit this point, but you have to be able to produce at least this much. That's the data that you need to figure out, do I have to scale this or not? So it's really going to depend on what kind of business you want to build, what market you're planning on going into, what the end use is, what scale they need. But that's all stuff that you should do before you really start thinking, okay, I've built this business. I'm absolutely going to do this. This is the one thing I do, my stake in the ground. And I know that I'll never have to scale, or that I will have to scale. These are all questions that should really be answered in the first month that you form a company, just by doing that customer discovery. A month sounds like a really tight timeline, but you don't want to waste that time. Your time is very valuable when you're getting started, and you need to be able to know what it is that you're going to do when you go into the lab before you go in. So for us, the very first thing that we looked at was how much glass do we have to be able to coat before anybody will care? And when we found the answer, which spoiler alert, was really high, we started thinking, okay, how can we translate what we're doing into the lab into a scalable process? And fortunately for us, that meant changing our deposition technique away from one technique to another, simply because what we were doing could be scaled to a certain point, but not beyond. Whereas switching to this other deposition technique, they make coating machines that are capable of coating pieces of glass that are, I think, 9 meters by 9 meters, which is bigger than anything that's going on in either industry we're looking at right now. So we knew, okay, if we can do this, if we can be compatible with this technique, scale up will be fairly straightforward, at least compared to trying to completely reinvent the wheel. This is what we should do, and this is what we need to do going forward. So the first piece of equipment we actually bought as a company was a different coater. So Anna's ball mill for $10,000. It's like, yep, that was us buying this new coater for about $10,000. It's a familiar story. But it just, in terms of what do we need to hit, who's going to care, that all came down to the customer discovery.
Thank you. Actually, that's a great lead into exactly that. Because this is indeed one of those areas that as we begin perhaps daydreaming about launching a business based on our science, we need to be aware that it takes far more than just the idea, right? It takes equipment and facilities, it takes people, nothing happens in a vacuum. It takes funding, it takes perhaps, you know, intellectual property, and clearly without a client or a need that is going to be resolved, you don't have a proposition. So all of these things tend to be wrapped around the traditional business plans. And so the first question is around that. If you guys actually use business plans to define your initial business structure, its strategy, and require resources as a means of making the decision to launch, not necessarily as an after the fact, oh, I already incorporated, I better start doing a business plan. The other question is about what resources did you actually have at the time of launch, and those that have been part of this forum in previous years. You know, we've had garage, you know, companies that are now worth several $1 million that literally started in garages to, you know, companies that actually needed a proper manufacturing facility to be in place before they could actually launch. And lastly, if there is actually a single resource for your particular story, right? Understanding that this is not a universal thing, but in your particular story, was there a single item that if it wasn't available, it would have probably skewed your launch ambitions? And this time I'm going to start with Anna.
Well, and I'm going to start with the last question, which is the single resource. And for me, that was probably the Portland State Business Accelerator. You know, when you're starting a materials company or a chemical company, having the space and the infrastructure to actually do that is, I mean, it's invaluable. You know, one of the things that makes me really jealous about software tech is it can be a guy in a coffee shop with a computer, like literally doesn't even need to own the chair and the table he's working on. But if you're doing a thing with actual stuff, you need space. And I think that's one of the real advantages of being a spin out of a university, is that there usually is space and there's agreements, and universities have become very startup friendly. And I know there's a couple of incubators that have realized, particularly in the biotech space, that having clean lab facilities and hoods and the ability to do biotech research is really what prohibits a lot of startups. So, that's an unfortunate resource that you need as a make a thing company. As far as the business plan goes, I did write a couple of business plans, sort of, from a non-real business perspective, I guess. I did, looking back on them, they're kind of funny because I knew at the time that they weren't real. This was these weren't real numbers. This wasn't going to actually happen the way it happened, but I did get some grant funding on it. And part of the exercise is just thinking about it, not just thinking about who your customer is, but what your supply chain is going to look like. What are you going to buy from who? What are you going to do to it? And then who are you going to sell it to? And you may have an idea for that, but actually having to put it down on paper and then write some rationale behind it can be really eye-opening in many ways. And it's more of an exercise for you, I think, than actually producing any hard plan. So for Stark Street materials, we had a patent that had issued, and that started many years ago when I was a graduate student. I initially got some funding from Portland State University and from Business Oregon, and most recently from a couple of other incubators. And then sort of buying small equipment. I've always been a very frugal person, just in general. And so, having a small lab and a small budget and figuring out how to make use of restaurant supply equipment instead of having to buy the lab equipment. Amazon is kind of an amazing resource. You can really buy anything for really cheap. I'm not working with any toxic chemicals, materials, or biohazards. And so that really has cut down on a lot of the sort of risk mitigation. I do have to say I invested in a lot of N95 masks for my lab, not for virus reasons, but for producing particulate. And I've gone at it really with the bare bones attitude that this was, so just as a pitch for the Thursday session, I'm leading the funding panel. And one of the questions I'm going to be really specific about asking my panel is that how do you use funding to most specifically identify the next milestone you need to get to? And so a lot of grants are based on these where it's, not here's some money, we expect at the end of this for you to be a multi-billion-dollar company. It's here's some money, here's what you're going to do with it to get to the next milestone so you can be appealing to the next funding round, or you can prove that something works or doesn't work, or what are these really specific goals? And so I think that's particularly when it comes to funding and people and equipment and thinking about building and managing a company, is really putting in those achievable milestones and validating particular pieces of the puzzle, and then figuring out how those pieces are going to fit together sequentially to eventually be a self-standing company if you're going the grant funding route.
Excellent, thank you. Jenn,
yeah, absolutely. So I think this is it's a really interesting set of questions, and I think the answer to a lot of these, they're all kind of interlinked, so well chosen, I guess. In terms of a business plan, when people say business plan, they usually mean some kind of formal document that outlines, here's my business, here's what I'll be doing, here's my expected revenue, usually here's my path to first revenue, here's what I expect, here's how much money I'm going to need, all of that. No, we didn't have anything like that in place. I wish I could say that we did and that we knew absolutely what we were doing, but the nature of the beast is that things are going to change a lot over time. There's a reason that fail fast and iterate is such a cliche saying at this point. It's because it's true. So we did have a business plan. It was very much hand wavy, I guess is the best way I can put it. We had an idea of what things were going to look like and what we needed. We were able to identify resources. But for the most part, it was just, here's what we think we need. Here's where we know we don't have the resources that we need to actually make this succeed. Here's our plan for getting them. If you're looking at starting a business, beyond customer discovery, I think the most important thing you can possibly do is a SWOT analysis as you're getting formed. So that would be strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Identifying strengths, we're all scientists. Presumably, if you're doing this, you have the technical know-how to make whatever it is that you want to make for your first product or prototype. Weaknesses, usually we're not business people, so that can be something you look at right away and go, business plan, I don't even know what the parts of that are. I don't know how to put this together. Opportunities, looking at it and going, all right, what's really out there? What market am I addressing? Who can I talk to help me with this? And then threats, things like, who's the actual competition? What solution are they using right now? What are the threats to just getting my business off the ground? I think Anna raised a really interesting point saying that everything she works with is pretty benign in terms of chemicals. In my lab, that's very much not the case. So not having a dedicated waste stream would have sunk us because we have chemical waste that we have to take care of and you can't just dump that down the sink. Resources at the time of launch, Anna covered this already. I got very lucky. This started as a university spin out. Oregon State has the Advantage Accelerator on campus, and so we were able to go to them. We also talked a lot with the Office of Commercialization and Corporate Development, OCCD, otherwise known as the Tech Transfer Office. They're the people that help you with patents and everything. I keep saying the word people over and over again, and it really came down to who we knew and who we were comfortable asking for help because we were within that university ecosystem. And being able to go to them and say, okay, I don't know what I'm doing and I need your help with this. Can you give me some time in the next 2 weeks to help me out was invaluable. A single resource that if not available would have ended our launch ambitions. Yeah, it really comes down to those people. When we were building the team, we were thinking about, okay, what do we have as strengths? What do we need? So being able to talk to people, get their feedback on what it was that we were doing and things that we hadn't even thought about, like, oh, you're incorporating? What kind of corporation are you incorporating as? Because this can be something that presents a real headache for you later on if you have to change it. That was something we didn't know, but we were able to get an answer to thanks to our network. So having access to that expertise, which I guess I'm cheating and identifying as a single resource, was the most important thing for us when we got started.
It's not cheating. So I want to be cognizant of time. We have about 10 minutes in our scheduled presentation, and I know Katrine has to go, and we basically have a couple of additional sets of questions to go. So I'm going to turn to Katrine and see if we can attempt to be on time.
So I'll just comment briefly. I think Jen said something I wanted to build off of. Everything changes. So whatever you write down in a plan, yes, it will change. However, Anna also made an essential point. It is so eye-opening to write things down. If you can't write down your plan, you don't have a plan. And you can feel like, well, I don't know enough to write it down. Well, start the discipline of writing it down. And it's probably not going to look like some document that maybe you imagine an imaginary business plan looks like, but there's some fundamental pieces. Budget on a multi-year basis, not just the first few months, but really push yourself. And you're gonna say, but I don't know these numbers. Force yourself to think about it. What are the key assumptions? The things that you're saying, well, I believe this to be true. Okay, write that down, because those key assumptions will help you realize, do I know enough to believe that assumption? Or am I just hoping? So a budget and then that bigger projection, if you're taking capital or not, revenues, et cetera, but really thinking through your financial plan. It's not a financial exercise, it's a strategic exercise. And you're going to end up going back to your science assumptions and how much it's going to cost and how you're going to do the experiments and how long it's going to take, your market assumptions, all of these things. And it's going to force you to think about pieces of business. Do you have enough money in there for marketing? Do you have enough money in there for your permits, whatever permits you need, and so on and so forth? So a financial plan really helps you think through a lot of the pieces of the business. It's just a tool to bring it all together, but being able to write down those key assumptions also tells you where you need to focus your attention. And the other thing that I think of is, one of the other key parts of generally part of a business plan is whatever your fundamental description of the company, your pitch of the company, you're going to give it 1,000,000 times. And it helps to give it to a lot of different audiences. I will tell you, so like when you're taking a company public, you actually have the lawyers review it, the accountants review it, your investors review it, everybody reviews it. You get to give that thing a lot. And I remember when I was home for Christmas, just before we took Editas public, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to give it to my family and see what they think. 'Cause I was so sick of this presentation, but I just needed fresh eyes on it. And I'll tell you, it was incredibly helpful. They pointed out a bunch of things that I wasn't explaining well, or that I'd gotten tired of talking about. And so, that process of telling people about the company essentially is telling people what your plan is and being able to articulate it clearly, and for people to reflect back on you. I have no idea what you're talking about. That's not their fault. That's your fault that you didn't either understand preconceived notions they brought to the table, or you assumed they knew things that they didn't. So I think, when I think of what's a business plan, it's your financial plan, it's your fundamental pitch or your fundamental description of the company. And, there are other things. You can have an organizational plan, who you're going to hire when. These are all different pieces of the puzzle. Collectively, that's your business plan. And maybe you bind it up into one document, and maybe you don't. If you're going public, it's called your S1, and you precede it with 100 pages of risk factors, which are kind of stomach-churning to write. But any business, even if you never give a copy to somebody, that discipline for yourself, and if you have more people in your team, the process of writing it together creates tremendous alignment with your team about what you're doing and where you're going. So that process for you, and if it's with a team, the team is a huge benefit to building your business.
Thank you. So again, perfect lead. So that process, as Katrine has pointed out, is far more complicated than just the business plan. We have to be aware that there are laws regulating the creation of the company, and the way that, as Jen pointed out, the way that you actually organize matters in the short-term, mid-term, and long-term outlook of your company. If you're going to bring in venture capital or additional partners to the door, that incorporation manner can end up being very costly if you don't do it correctly initially. Of course, I've been saying this, and everybody else has been saying it, you have to bring others in line. You have to think about intellectual property, and I am aware that there is a question regarding that in the chat. You have to be aware of facilities. We have to be aware of things like inventory and logistics, as well as your sales, customer service, marketing, and client acquisition, along with the need to raise funds. So clearly it is something that the idea that we may have as scientists that entice us to launch a company, in executing, we have to sort of move beyond that excitement and start thinking about really that whole picture and items that actually influence our ability of launching a successful company. Lastly, depending on your space, of course, you have to deal with regulatory compliance, and that can be complicated and expensive, to say the least. So the questions to the panelists are, what are your suggestions for those that are looking at launching a business around their science to focus their initial efforts on? And the follow-up is, in your experience, what are the pitfalls that can happen if aspiring entrepreneurs neglect one of or more than one of these things? So they're interlinked. It's basically asking the same question from two different points of view. Katrine, since you're the last to speak, you'll be the first one to speak here.
You know, I do think that it's a little bit, redundant at this point, but I think that focusing on what problem am I solving, who's the customer, what's the market, is where I would start. I would say too that a lot of times with the scientific business, this is it's sort of a complicated question, right? Because by having a new technology, you think you could do something that hasn't ever been done before. So on the one hand, you want to talk to potential customers and really understand them, and they will give you great feedback. But sometimes you're thinking like, but you don't even, you can't even imagine what's possible. You're creating a new market that didn't exist before. And you're going to feel a little push and pull because maybe you see possibilities that your purported customer just can't imagine. It's often the case with new medicines, right? You think, well, geez, isn't that the easiest one? It's like, actually, no. If you want to treat cancer, for example, a lot of times the doctor is like, well, I need you to treat all these patients that can't be treated with any of the other medicines. And what if you're like, no, I can, we should be used first. We can totally change treatment. Or, for example, there are diseases where they're much more common than people think they're rare, but they're actually much more common because patients just don't seek treatment. Multiple sclerosis is a great example. They used to think there were less than 200,000 patients in the United States. It was considered an orphan indication. Over the years, all these new medicines come out, and there's, I don't know the numbers now, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of patients. There's a lot more people with MS than people had realized. They just weren't self-identifying. There's thousands of examples like this. So I think you're going to feel a little, with a scientific company in particular, you're going to feel pushed and pulled between the customers actually understand what's possible. Maybe they can't imagine it because this is so new. There's not an easy answer to that. I think you need to try to really listen candidly, but also figure out, how do I build a market? And there, I think, again, coming back to something we said before, but talking to people who've been through that experience can be really helpful. All these other things are important. I think some are easier, like Incorporation is pretty straightforward. Get a lawyer, they can help you with that. Get a good lawyer who understands startups, there's good ways to do it. You don't need to reinvent every wheel. You're inventing some wheels. Don't reinvent all of these, right? Incorporation is straightforward. Facilities hopefully will be solvable. There are options, right? There are scientific facilities out there. It's complicated the moment you're doing it, and then a year later you're like, wow, that was nothing compared to other challenges, and so on and so forth. So I think if there's a real need for what you're doing, other things tend to follow that problem that you're solving.
Thank you. Jenn, do you want to follow up?
Sure. I think Katrine hit the nail on the head. You need to know what problem it is that you're trying to solve. And the only way that you can do that is by doing that market analysis and finding out who's actually going to buy this if I ever make it. Will anybody care? I know the temptation as scientists is always to be like, oh, I have this great new technology and I'll just shove it out into the marketplace and everyone will buy it. But that's really not how it works. So in terms of pitfalls, it really comes down to, you don't want to be the guy that is trying to sell something into a market where they just don't care, or where the market is actually shrinking because people are moving away from whatever your customer is doing to something else. I know that we get scared about IP and licensing and all of that, but again, just to copy what Katrine said, get a good lawyer, they'll help you with it. I can touch briefly on the question in the chat. Navigating IP licensing is something that universities are pretty happy to do because they make money back when they license the patent to you. So from that standpoint, the IP is not nearly as big of a problem as you would think. What really is, and what can really sink your company, is pouring a lot of money and time, especially the time, into trying to solve a problem that nobody cares about. So that's the big pitfall that you have to avoid. And that's what doing that good market analysis, good customer discovery can help you avoid. So that's what you can't skimp on.
Excellent. Anna?
I don't know that I have a huge amount to add other than a way to maybe think about this. I think about when you have an idea and maybe you even have a potential market as thinking about it backwards. So, there's who's going to buy it, and then how your company is going to, we talk about exit strategies a lot. So what is your potential exit strategy, or what is your pathway to market? So in biotech, pathway to market always involves the FDA. And so being able to plan for that, plan for those hundreds of millions of dollars for a drug to get through the FDA really defines how you're going to set up your company, how you're going to have to fundraise, all sorts of things. Because you can't really bootstrap a drug or a pharmaceutical company. You literally can't sell it unless you have some other product. If you're a materials supply company, that's more or less what I know. There are unregulated products that I can sell, and that may be a way to raise some revenue to get to the next phase. But I am going to have to go through some sort of FDA or GMP facility round before I can sell my product to as a medical device. And so there's a whole bunch of hurdles, and there's a bunch of funding, and there's a bunch of milestones I have to reach to get from point A to point B to point C. And so looking at what that path is, and what that might be, and then starting your business plan based on what that path is. So if you want to be a lifestyle business where you're just making some stuff and selling some stuff, and that's kind of that, an LLC is probably a reasonable way to go. If you need to raise a large amount of capital to get through some of those really big hurdles, specifically the FDA, you're going to want to be a C Corp, because nobody's going to invest in you unless there's a whole bunch of money. I'm less familiar with the S Corp. That's anyway, that's a good conversation for you and your lawyer. But figuring out what you want that company to be, what your role in that company is going to be through these different milestones, and then making strategic decisions early on based on those goals, even if they change. At least you thought about it, and at least you planned for what you were planning to do.
Thank you. So I'm aware that Katrine has other business to attend, so I'm gonna skip to Jim to see if there are questions from the audience that we can address, and then I'll ask the speakers to close their with their final thoughts.
There is one more question, and it is a single product-based startup pragmatic as far as a vision for business concerned? Is it worth waiting to figure out potential for product diversification before going ahead with a startup?
Maybe I'll jump in. You certainly can have a single product company. There are plenty of them. They do exist. It's going to put a lot of shape to your company in the, what is the capital required to get to the point where you have first revenue, and how are you going to get that capital? Anna was just talking about how one of her products is going to need a lot of capital, but other things she can sell and get some revenue along the way. That shapes the business one way. In biotech, you have a lot of single product companies that are set up that way, and the capital strategy is designed to support that. So I think it's really, it could make sense. I think understanding what the implications are of that is important, and how long and how much money will it take you to get to that product being able to be sold. I think the other thing to think about is the life cycle of developing a product and then selling and manufacturing a product. You often need different kinds of people along that continuum. And so through the path to get there, you may need to change your team. Not because anybody's doing a bad job, but some people are going to want to evolve along with that product, and some people won't. And you're also going to need different expertise when you're commercializing it as compared to when it's really just new technology and evolving. So there are implications to that strategy, which can absolutely be managed, but you just want to think through those implications. Talk to somebody who's done a single product company and ask them what that journey was like. It's also a different risk level. If that product fails, what are you going to do? But all these things are risky, so I think you also have the benefit of being able to just focus, and being able to focus is also helpful. So it can work. It's just understand the implications.
Okay, so we seem to have another question from the audience.
I just wanted to jump in really quick on that last one, super fast. I would say less important is, single products, again, I'm speaking from material science, is knowing your market, knowing, in my case, who uses radiation and who wants radiation shielding. Anybody who uses radiation has to use radiation shielding. What kind of product that might look like, I know a lot about the radiation market and the radiation shielding market at the moment. With that said, I'm going to have a lot of different products and a lot of different tailored products, but it's, you're moving out of the science where you know one reaction really well and what all the variants of it are, to knowing what the ecosystem looks like. So knowing your market is probably more important than anything.
Okay, and there is a question in the chat about improving funding chances, but Anna actually is running the forum on Thursday that will actually discuss that. So I invite all of you to take a part of that particular forum. And in
the specific questions I'm going to ask all of the panelists.
There you go. So with that, and being aware of the time, any closing remarks from our panelists?
I'll just say that if you want to go this path, know that there will be moments when you doubt yourself, like a lot of them, but that doesn't mean it's the wrong choice. And if you ever are having one of those doubt yourself moments, that's when to reach out to people in this audience who've been there, because there are gonna be times when you just need somebody else to help pull you up, so you just don't feel like it's only you all the time. But it's incredibly satisfying as well. You're building something. You're not just building the product, you're building an organization. It's just very, very satisfying.
Thank you. Anna or Jen?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jen.
Okay. I was going to say, if you think of this as something that you want to do, the early work that you have to do to set up a company is not anything that has a ton of risk associated with it. I mean, prior to incorporation, you're really just figuring out, is this the right fit for me? Does anybody care about what I'm doing? You're going to spend some time doing it. And depending on what your schedule is like, that might be a bit of an ask. But you're mostly going to be talking to people and trying to figure out, do I have a good product market fit? That by itself is pretty low risk. It's not until you incorporate and decide to put that stake in the ground that you're really putting yourself out there and opening yourself up to, oh God, what do I do if this fails? So if you're thinking about it, it's worth at least doing that preliminary groundwork. And there's a lot of different resources that can teach you how to do it. NSF has a few on their website. Virtue Lab, one of the sponsors of this, actually can probably connect you with things like the Clean Tech Accelerator, stuff like that, to kind of give you an idea, what do I really have to have in place before I can start applying to things like this and really making this real. They're all very nice people. They are a nonprofit, so they're not going to charge you anything to talk with them. And they can help you figure out what questions you need to answer before you can do anything. So it's low risk, high reward if you succeed. Even if you fail, it still looks good on your resume. So if you're thinking about doing it, do it.
Yeah, so what I'd like to add to Jen's statement, and she sort of touched on this a little bit, is if you get bit by the entrepreneur bug, you know you got bit, and you are waking up in the middle of the night thinking about it, and you can be kind of obsessed with it, and that's going to carry you quite a ways. It won't carry you the entire way, but entrepreneurism is something that's really exciting when you feel it and you have it, and it, like I said, it doesn't take you the whole way. There's still a lot of hard work and a lot of tears and everything to get through it. But if you think this is something for you, you'll know it. And then the other thing I wanted to add was I completely lost my train of thought with the being excited about things. Oh, well, we were talking about ideas. This session is about an idea to a market, and you've had a lot of ideas. If you're a student, you've had a lot of ideas in an academic setting, and the set of values and the set of what is an interesting idea in an academic setting is kind of different from what is interesting in a market idea. So understanding that you are going through a big cultural transition from academia, lab research, scientific research to marketplace, and the facts are still the same, right? Like you can still mix an acid and a base and make a big explosion, but the values of what is interesting to somebody and what is worth thinking about, what is worth doing, what somebody's interested in hearing about, are kind of different. And there's a culture shock. There was a huge culture shock for me, and it was very uncomfortable. But you can figure out what those different values are, and then know what your values are as well, and where they match, where they don't match, and who has what values. If you're sitting in front of a venture capitalist, you can be pretty sure what their values are. They want to make more money. If you're sitting in front of an NSF panel who's going to fund SBIRs, it's not entirely clear what their values are, and they like it that way. So just knowing who values what, who values why, and that there are different cultures can really help transition.
Awesome. Jim, I'm going to turn this to you to see if there are more questions or if you want to wrap it up.
I will wrap it up. So I would like to thank Jenn in particular for mentioning Virtue Lab. Their person who helps with SBIRs, their expert is Leon Wolf. He will be part of Anna's panel on Thursday, and Virtue Lab is a sponsor of OSSF. I'd like to remind you that tomorrow at noon Pacific, we will be hearing from a panel of primarily lawyers and investors called How to Form a Company. Be very exciting. I hope to see you there. And then I'd like to invite you all to turn on your camera and wave hello, and turn on your mute, and turn off your mute, and say thank you very much to our panel. Thank you all very much for your help and advice today. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Have a great day, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
And thank you, Jim, for all the
You're welcome.
organization.
Yes, for sure. Good job.
Definitely.
Goodbye.